Ballot item number 66, Order M98, second reading of Bill 98, an act to amend the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act 1997 with respect to loss of earnings and survivor benefits. Ms. French.
The member for Oshawa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move second reading of Bill 98, an act to amend the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act 1997 with respect to loss of earnings and survivor benefits.
Ms. French has moved second reading of Bill 98, an act to amend the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act 1997 with respect to loss of earnings and survivor benefits. Pursuant to Standing Order 98, the member has 12 minutes for a presentation. The member for Oshawa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is always my privilege to rise in the legislature and add my voice to the debate, but today is a very special and important opportunity. Today I am here to present and debate my first private member's bill, Bill 98, the Protecting Victims of Occupational Disease Act 2015. It is appalling that hundreds of Ontarians fall victim to occupational disease every year, and it is even more appalling that we allow them and their families to be hung out to dry. We hope to bring an end to this today. It is also my privilege to recognize guests and supporters who are here today in the legislature. This bill came together as the result of the partnerships of people working together for years to make a necessary change for workers and their families. So today, I am pleased to welcome President Rick Bertrand, who I believe has traveled the farthest today. Mr. Bertrand is the President of United Steelworkers Local 6500 in Sudbury. He is here on behalf of the miners and their widows who were first involved in this issue. In addition to Mr. Bertrand, I would like to thank JP Mrochek, USW Local 6500's employee compensation representative, who has worked tirelessly to represent workers and widows in their community on issues pertaining to the WSIB and health and safety. JP and Local 6500 have been a driving force behind this legislation. Thank you and welcome to Queen's Park, and welcome to Jerry LeBlanc, who is here as the Health and Safety Department leader at the USW National Office. I am also pleased to welcome and sincerely thank Sid Ryan, the President of the Ontario Federation of Labour, for joining us at Queen's Park today. And I want to recognize the work and support from the OFL team over these past years on this issue. Thank you for your commitment and your continued support. Thank you to President Carmen Santoro of the Ontario Professional Firefighters Association for his support and involvement. And I welcome Andrew Lee, co-chair of the OPFFA Occupational Disease Committee, to the legislature. Also in the members' gallery joining us today is Trish Fontaine, here from the Office of the Worker Advisor. Welcome and thank you for your commitment to workers' rights. And I also see and want to recognize from my riding of Oshawa, Joel Smith joining us from Unifor Local 222. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, I want to recognize Miss Oram and Miss Roca, who are watching this afternoon from Sudbury. I look forward to sharing their stories with you today. The story of this bill started long before I came across the issue, Mr. Speaker. Last winter, I had the opportunity to meet with JP Mrochek, the employee compensation representative for USW Local 6500. JP was representing miners and their widows 4 years ago when a technicality, a legislative loophole, if you will, was first discovered and used by employers' lawyers to target the survivor benefits paid to widows of miners who had died of occupational diseases. Widows who had lost their husbands to long, drawn-out illnesses contracted while working in the mines were being targeted. At that time in 2010, JP and Local 6500 started to appeal to the then Minister of Labour and connect with others who would help workers and their surviving spouses. I would like to recognize the work that started back then and thank my colleague, France Gelina, the member from Nickel Belt, who has been championing this issue since the start of 2011. Since early 2011, this government has had 4 Ministers of Labour who have all heard from USW 6500, the member from Nickel Belt, and the Ontario Federation of Labour on this issue. Recently, as the target has shifted predominantly to the surviving spouses of firefighters, this government has also been hearing from the OPFFA as well. 4 ministers of labour, Mr. Speaker. In fairness, this government has acknowledged that this is an area to be addressed, and today we have the opportunity to make that change. So here we are. I am proposing the changes that are long overdue in Bill 98. It's time to pass this bill and make the changes we've been talking about for 4 years. Since 2011, there have been at least 14 workplace safety and insurance appeals tribunal decisions that have resulted in the WSIB reducing the pensions or periodic payments to the surviving spouses of workers who have died of occupational diseases. Mr. Speaker, the issue started with miners in Sudbury, but it applies to all workers in this province that are susceptible to occupational diseases. If the worker, say a steam fitter or miner or a firefighter, was diagnosed after they had retired, then their widow's survivor benefits would be in question. The catch was that in retirement, they were no longer earning wages. Pensions, incidentally, are not considered earnings. And there is the basic loophole. Widows' pensions were being calculated one way, but the lawyers argued it should be calculated another. The lawyers won the argument. They argued the letter of the law, but today we are here arguing the spirit of the legislation. Mr. Speaker, these victims have already lost their spouses to an occupational disease, and it is unconscionable that we have allowed even more to be taken from them. We have the opportunity to change that today. Giselle Oram is at home in Sudbury today. She was kind enough to share what the survivor's benefit means to her. Ms. Oram lost her husband Harold to mesothelioma, an occupational disease he contracted while working in the mine. She said, "For me it means life, more or less. Before I finally got the money, I was depressed. People were scared for me that I was going to die. I was so depressed. The government paid for some of the medication, but the government doesn't pay for glasses or dentures. It all comes out of pocket. And then you have to pay rent after all that. When my husband died, the bill people kept calling me. I know that money comes in, and I can pay my bills. And before that, I would be broke after the first week. It means I can breathe. Another thing, too, I've been sleeping in my lazy boy for 4 years. When the money came in, the first thing I went out and bought was a bed. I was tired of living in a chair." Mr. Speaker, I was also pleased to speak with Ann Roca. Mrs. Roca lost her husband to an occupational disease as a result of working in the mine. She worries that someone will come after her and her pension. She cannot imagine what she would do if that were to happen. "If I didn't have it, I'd lose my house. That's the bottom line. I'm grateful for the benefits I get, and I don't know why they want to take them away. It means a roof over our head, for one thing. My husband and I sacrificed to get this house. If they take that away, then I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what I'd do without the money coming in. I wish my husband was here instead, but that's not going to happen." Mr. Speaker, people who have lost this much already need to be protected before they lose the support they are entitled to, and that's what this bill is about. I'm going to do my best to explain a fairly complicated part of our compensation system. I'm going to explain the old rules versus the new rules for compensating workers who have been diagnosed with an occupational disease in their retirement. Imagine 2 co-workers. One gets sick and is diagnosed with an occupational disease while working. WSIB compensates him fairly and pays a loss of earnings benefit. Loss of earnings. This is based on his loss of earnings potential. Now imagine his co-worker doesn't get sick. He instead retires. However, his disease has a longer latency and he doesn't get diagnosed, doesn't get sick until he had stopped working. So then what happens? By the old rules, which determined payments from 1998 to 2009, that worker would have also received the loss of earnings payment. Fair is fair. His workplace made him sick, so he received compensation. However, after 2009, this practice of paying loss of earnings ended. By the new rules, fair isn't fair anymore. Now, if a worker is diagnosed after they retire, they can no longer receive the loss of earnings benefit because lawyers of employers argued that if they are retired, they aren't earning, and therefore they aren't losing earnings. So, this loophole saves the employers having to compensate for a dangerous, toxic, and slowly fatal workplace because of a wording technicality. Employers will hope a worker retires before diagnosis so they aren't eligible for a loss of earnings payment. This, incidentally, incentivizes a slower process for care and diagnosis, and this is not in the spirit of the Act. My bill calls to continue the practice of fair compensation under the old rules. If the government or the lawyers want to argue that it isn't fair to calculate based on loss of earnings, then what is fair? Is it fair to compensate based on the loss of time with loved ones, loss of time with grandkids, loss of retirement, loss of health, loss of quality of life, or just loss of life? I hope that you won't argue the spirit of the Act, and I hope the government sees the unfairness of calling the diagnosis date the date of injury, when the dates of actual injury and injurious exposure resulting in the diagnosis happened on the job. We can haggle here over definitions, or, as I believe this ministry recognizes and understands, we can have the chance to make something right for real people. We have the chance to make it right for people who have died or will because their workplace made them sick, to make it right for people who have lost their loved ones and now face losing the bulk of the financial compensation that keeps them in their homes with bills paid and food on the table. Let's pass this bill today and move it to committee where it can make this right. We can hammer it out in committee and make this story about what is fair and what is decent. Mrs. Oram in Sudbury shared this with me. She said, they had a ceremony for the people who died at the mine, and for the first time they had a ceremony for the people who died of disease. I'm really glad I was there. A lot of people die of disease from working in the mines. I remember waking up with headaches. A lot of people got sick and died because of the mine, even though they didn't work there. But they couldn't prove it. It was in the air. We didn't know any better. Mr. Speaker, we know better now. We are adding recognized presumptive diseases and cancers as we are recognizing the risks and many toxins in workplaces. Our firefighters are constantly exposed to dangers and carcinogens. We have come a long way since the early days. Hopefully, we will see a decrease in the diagnoses of occupational diseases. Hopefully, we can have safer workplaces where fatalities and diseases can't happen. As we work towards that, however, we must protect the victims of occupational disease and defend their surviving families and spouses today. This is a bill that needs to be passed and an issue that cannot be ignored. There is important and technical work to be done in committee to ensure the best fix to this problem happens, and happens soon. I am eager to get this bill into the committee process and out the other side. I hope all members of this House will vote today to pass Bill 98 to protect the victims of occupational disease. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.